are going to be on some of the market codes, so on CACM for the implementation of market coupling, on the integration of balancing markets. Then we'll have one network code on the ENTSO guidelines and regional coordination discussed. And finally, we'll talk about the different types of requirements, the more technical network codes for generators. With that in mind, perhaps let's go into the next slide on why do we need network codes. So the first thing to say, I think, is that the context for the electricity system in Europe is changing. It's changing fast. We know the objective of decarbonization, which means that a lot of the generating capacity will be intermittent in the future. We've seen already significant growth. As you see, 14 countries are likely to have wind and solar output higher than 80% of demand already in 2025. This also implies some potential curtailment risks, and we already see some tensions in some places, for instance, Ireland, Germany, for instance, today. We also see a reduction in dispatchable capacity as a number of thermal plants, which are not economic, are being retired. All of that means that we have to strengthen our grid. And as you see, ENTSO-E has already anticipated that 150 billion euros of transmission investments are needed. Now, that background is useful to assess the contribution of network codes, which you see on the right. We've identified 5 key items here: the management of variability, plus uncertainty on the production of renewable sources, enabling cross-border flows to take advantage of different generation mixes across borders and in different locations, dealing with higher complexity in operations and also closer to real time, and connecting a lot of smaller distributed units with the rise of distributed generation and prosumers, and empowering consumers. So all of these different contributions, I would say, are enabled by network codes. So network codes are not necessarily what is, I would say, creating that value directly, but that value could not be created without a key enabler, which is the network codes. Let us move on, please, to the next slide. So another point I'd like to flag is that the network codes, beyond being an enabler, are actually the foundation of the internal energy market. And you see that being reflected in the different families of codes, and it's probably useful to remind everybody of these 3 main families. You have connection codes, which basically set a number of requirements for generators, deal with the connection issues. You have network codes focused on operation, system operation, but also, very importantly, emergency and restoration. And then you've got network codes which are very much market-oriented. So based on that, let me perhaps turn the speaking floor to Mathilde, because I think, Mathilde, you wanted to give a perspective on these network codes, the different families, and ENTSO-E's role in all of that.
Indeed. Hello, everyone. So, as Fabien mentioned, the context is changing rapidly, bringing to the system new actors, new challenges, and giving more and more importance to the cross-border dimensions. So first, as it was mentioned previously, new actors are coming into the systems physically through new units connecting mostly on the distribution grid, enhancing the coordination with DSOs, and developing an important need for visibility and observability on the generation, distributed generation, but also on the market. New entrants are coming, such as demand-side response players, and bringing new challenges and new needs for the system. Secondly, new challenges for the system arise with less conventional plants and more renewables generation, bringing more uncertainties into the system, into the operation, which requires, as said, more observability and also more market tools, marketplace to trade close to real time and be able to take most of what the grid can bring in terms of resource optimizations. And thirdly, the cross-border dimension is more and more important to enhance those resource optimizations and to build a truly competitive European market, which can allow huge flows transiting across Europe. And for this, we need a secure operation, and we need to also use the existing infrastructures more efficiently and in a safe way. And to answer these challenges, the network codes are a basis of binding rules, which applies to TSOs and market parties and stakeholders in three main families: the connection codes, operation codes, and market codes. So the connection codes give some rules for the connection of generation side, demand side connections, and also HVDC lines. The operation codes gives some rules about system operation and emergency and restorations. And finally, the market codes gives a foundation for the European energy market in terms of capacity allocation and congestion management for day-ahead and intraday timeframes, in terms of forward capacity allocations for long terms, and in terms of electricity balancing closer to real time. These network codes are binding rules and address all the cross-border issues for the different market parties and stakeholders, and they intend to run a secure, competitive and low-carbon energy markets. If we go to the next slides. Here, so you can, on the left side of the slides, recall the process of the network codes from the framework guideline to the implementation of the code, going through the comitology process. So you have in blue the market codes, in orange the operational codes, and in purple the connection codes. And you can see that all of them will be entered into force by the end of 2017, which means that we are already for some of them in the implementation phase, and for the others in early implementation phase. And today, some substantial progress has already been made through some early implementation projects, as we will see in the use cases, and a lot remains to be done in order to turn these network codes into a reality for the system and the market. So now I will give back the floor to Fabien to make the link between these network codes and the objectives of the current European energy policy.
Thank you, Mathilde, and we can move to slide 6. So basically what we have tried here is to categorize the contribution of the different network codes against the three main objectives of European energy policy. So you're well familiar with that triangle of objectives: sustainability, decarbonization, competitiveness, and security of supply. So let me spell out some of the contributions of network codes. So if we first look at decarbonization and sustainability, well, when it comes to renewables, of course, some of the connection codes are useful to provide clear rules for connection of different units and harmonize provide a uniform framework for that. That's also useful more generally to facilitate the integration of renewables. And on the demand side, of course, engaging consumers requires a framework for them to have access to the market, and that's really part of the contribution of the network codes to, I would say, engaging consumers. On the second main pillar of European energy policy, competitiveness and cost, well, clearly, if you have a better market and if network codes can improve the functioning of the market, that's going to ultimately reduce costs and benefit to consumers. Similarly, if the network codes allow some degree of harmonization on the technology side and on some of the requirements for connection, that can help reducing total costs. And more generally, if network codes are part of an effort to increase liquidity, transparency, and ultimately competition, that again will contribute to reducing costs for customers. Finally, on security of supply, well, clearly having a more robust grid and having a better system for emergency restoration, for instance, contributes to security of supply. On the management of interruptibility and variability of renewables, which we mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, clearly network codes will play a key role. And finally, the regional cooperation of system operators, which we will discuss later on, and which is part of the network codes, will clearly encourage, I would say, greater solidarity, and from that will come a number of benefits in terms of security of supply. So I think it's time perhaps to be a little bit more concrete, and I'll hand over to Charles. Charles, you've done some detailed computations of some of these benefits, and perhaps on slide 7 you can take us through some of these key indicators.
Exactly. So indeed, in slide 7 you have a few figures just to illustrate the kind of benefits the network codes are contributing to before we go into more details with the case studies. So just for instance, looking at sustainability, network codes and their early implementation is a key enabler to connecting and managing a lot of new renewables. So we have today a system which works with 260 gigawatts of solar and wind generation, which the networks are able to manage efficiently. And already in 2016, you have about 25 gigawatts of new generation units connected, and the vast majority of it is renewable units, 86%. And we expect that this pace of connection will continue over the next decade, which means that we need to adapt this power system. And again, the network code is really a key tool to achieve that. Also looking at, for instance, demand-side response, we have today a bit more than 11 gigawatts of demand-side response, and the network code will give a framework to expand this level of demand-side response, for instance, by providing some requirements on demand connection to provide demand-side response. Maybe last point regarding, or last example regarding sustainability is the need for being able to manage flows across Europe efficiently to manage the variability of generations over these big regions, and to flow electricity where it's needed. And to achieve that, one of the new technology which is used is the HVDC interconnections, and we can see in the TYNDP that we expect more than 40 HVDC cables to be built. And again, the network code gives the framework to achieve these connections of new lines. Looking at competition, competitiveness and social welfare, we will discuss a bit more the benefits of market coupling, for instance, but also looking at, for instance, intraday trading, we can see there is a very substantial growth in volume exchange on power exchanges in intraday. We have now about 120 terawatt-hours that are exchanged on these platforms, which are now coupled in some of the regions in Europe, and the process is still ongoing to achieve a European market for intraday as well. So very important volumes. And also we've mentioned just before, Fabien mentioned the importance of the transparency, and you can see also the progress that has been made by ENTSO in terms of transparency. If you look at the information which is provided on the website, we have now more than 10 million data files which are made available to market participants, and you have more than 2,000 users that are active every day on this platform, which shows again the improvements in terms of transparency. And maybe last point regarding security of supply. What has been achieved in the past few years, and that's also a form of early implementation of the network code, is that there is no major interruptions across several countries in the past decade. So since the big events we had in 2003 and 2006, no major event, and the network codes is actually putting in low the best practices that were identified following these major interruptions, and which has allowed TSOs to avoid the reproductions of similar situation. This is illustrated in the second figure in terms of coordination between TSOs. You can see that now the regional security coordinators are performing more than 3,000 coordinated tasks for the TSOs, and you have now hundreds of trained employees that went through the RSC's programs or that actually work for the RSCs and are back at the TSOs, and which has now a knowledge of the regional or European port system, and they can use this knowledge to the benefits of a more secure and more efficient operation of the system. So we may now go to the next slide to present the first case study. I will leave the floor to ENTSO-E on that.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon to everyone. I'm Athanasios Troupakis. I'm going to give a short overview of these two slides we have here on the case studies for the market network codes, starting with the CACM guideline, the first market network code to enter into force, focusing on the day and the intraday market, followed by the forward capacity allocation guideline. Here on the slides, we just try to map the main benefits of this coupling of the markets, starting with the day-ahead markets. We're very happy to observe this expansion of the market coupling from all across the regions in Europe, the then NWE region, down to the rest of Europe. You see in the map all the countries that are coupled, either flow-based or ATC-based. Our estimates are that annual potential of welfare is around 1 billion euros per year, and also the volumes traded in the day-ahead exchanges are similar to those you heard about the intraday. Of course, this being a live process and it's still continuing, of course, it's now under the general framework of the CACM guideline, and on top of that, there have been additional developments in the day-ahead market coupling since May 2015. We have the flow-based market coupling in the CW region, so the Central West Europe. You see it in the map colored in the dark blue, and which adds an additional 100 million euros a year of social benefits. And we expect this flow-based market coupling to expand now also to the Central East Europe in the framework of the core capacity calculation region under the CACM. And as a matter of fact, the capacity calculation methodologies for this region, both for the day ahead and the intraday, are currently being consulted as part of the official CACM process. So this is, let's say, a general overview of the benefits associated with the integration of the wholesale market, and what benefits we have seen and we expect more to yield from the CACM. Moving on to the next slide, we try to cover here the balancing network code, which was the last market and the last network code in general to be adopted. There we have gained some very useful experience by the early implementation of this guideline. It's been a long process, but we're able to build on the experience we gained there. And as early as 2013, we have identified what we call the pilot projects for balancing. So basically it was volunteer initiatives where TSOs started working together following the general guidelines of the balancing network code into and bringing the know-how into the future. So we have this cherry-picked 3 of them, and we present them in this slide. A typical example is the TERE project, expanding over the whole, let's say, west and a bit south of Europe, covering almost 80% of the countries who use the process of replacement reserves currently, and which expects to have an annual benefit of 120 million euros. On another process, the imbalance netting process, we have another successful project. It's the IGCC, covering the area around Germany and Austria, Switzerland, and Central East, some of the Central East countries, with estimated annual benefits of 80 million euros per year. I think it's important to mention that here is the benefits is basically avoiding to activate secondary control, but by netting the imbalances of these regions. And the third one is the Nordic reserves power market, which has an annual benefit of 220 million euros per year. I think it's a clear example of bringing together countries in the region with similar challenges, similar design elements, and facilitating the integration of these balancing markets. These are, let's say, examples of what we expect, and based on studies that were conducted earlier, the estimated benefits for the integration of balancing markets can be up to 500 to 800 million euros. So it's quite a significant amount from also this part of the network code. And for us, this let's say network code being so closely linked to the system operation, I think it will make the very good transition to the next part, which is system operations and regional security. So I'll head over to Crystal.
Hello everybody, also from me. I'm Crystal Romeo, and I will tell you about the case study number 3. We will hear later on about an event that triggered the establishment of voluntary initiatives for regional security coordination. The system split on November 4th, 2006, and it was a valuable lesson showing the importance of cooperation and coordination between TSOs. And following this event, the first voluntary initiatives, CORISO and TSU, were set up in 2008, followed by SEC in 2015, and Nordic and Baltic RSCs in 2016. And now, with the System Operation Guideline entering soon into force, the EU-wide coverage of RSCs is also written into EU law. The main mission of regional security coordinators is to maintain high level of security of supply through the services they provide to TSOs. And you can see the 5 services on this slide, starting from the common grid model. The RSCs merge the individual grid models they receive from TSOs into a common grid model and use it for other services like security analysis to ensure the compliance with the N-1 criterion, to detect constraints in the grid, and to prepare and activate remedial actions. Then capacity calculation, outage coordination, with the objective to identify any possible outage planning incompatibilities, and adequacy assessment, where the regional security coordinator assesses if the sum of generation and cross-border import capabilities meet the total load in a TSO's control area. The first mentioned 3 services are already provided by Chorizo, TSC and SEC. But of course, significant work still remains to implement all 5 services by all RSCs. However, if we move to the next slide, the next slide shows how the benefit of regional coordination is already evident when you look at the everyday operation of RSCs already today. And to give a few examples, the first indicator shows that illustrates the high performance of regional security coordinators in providing consistent output for congestion forecast and capacity calculation out of all individual inputs from the various TSOs. In the second example, Chorizo has identified in 2015 7 times more potentially critical situations compared to 2014, and this could be explained by 2 factors. That security issues are becoming more frequent due to increased renewables in system and more intense cross-border trading, but also because Chorizo has further improved its oversight and security analysis processes, allowing to identify situations more precisely. Nevertheless, in practice, there were few disturbances and only of limited scope, which means that RSCs and TSOs have been able to find remedial actions to manage well these potentially critical situations. A good indicator to demonstrate how RSCs foster the coordination between TSOs is, for example, the number of data files exchanged daily, which is already more than 10,000 files a day for the services that are currently running. And as Charles mentioned before, there are over 300 coordinated tasks per TSO a day. And in addition, Chorizo and TSC already make valuable recommendations to TSOs regarding remedial actions. You can see that 4,000 remedial actions proposed per year by Chorizo, or another example, the coordination of multilateral remedial actions, 134 by TSC. It's also worth to mention that since TSOs provide the operators for RSCs, RSCs can be as well seen as training platforms for operators who this way get to have a more detailed view on cross-border issues and the operation of interconnected systems. And now I give the floor to my colleague Carlos, who will talk about one good example of where TSOs in a coordinated way prepared for the solar eclipse in 2015.
Okay, thank you, Christelle. Indeed, I'm going to explain a bit how the TSOs coordinated to face the challenge of the solar eclipse. Basically, this was a challenge because it could have ended up like the event in 2006, where we all learned these valuable lessons. And just to explain a bit the challenge, if you see the graph, the difficulty here was the replacement of the energy taken out of the system due to the shadow produced by the eclipse. So in the first hour, the eclipse took out of the system 14 gigawatts, and then in the second phase of the eclipse, in 1 hour and a half, we recovered 21 gigawatts of energy. Just to make to have an idea of the scale of this amount of energy is like one nuclear reactor is 1.5 gigawatts, and here we have 21. So we had around, this could be the impact of switching on the 14 nuclear power plants in 1.5 hours. So what the TSOs did to benefit, to protect the system was, first of all, early planning and identification of the risks, and the proper coordination of already existing actions. During the day of the event, all TSOs were connected via internal communication tools, and they made sure that each individual TSO could cover their needs individually. And of course, in case of some TSO had some issue or difficulty to cover the demand, then they could activate special procedures to exchange reserves. When we talk about the cost and the benefits of this exercise, this was had a cost of extra additional reserves of 4.2 million euros, but the benefit was the avoiding a system split and a possible blackout, which could be way more expensive. And looking at the future, as I said before, the big RAM was 21 gigawatts in 1.5 hours, and due to the increase of renewable energy sources in future clips, future events, we can expect bigger RAMs due to the larger amount of these generators. And I think now it's time for my colleague Ioannis to talk about the connection codes.
Yeah, thank you, Carlos. Actually, I'm going to refer to the disturbance that my colleague Crystal just referred a few slides ago. In fact, actually, it makes all sense to split this slide with her, because the lessons that we learned from this incident, we took them over to both to two families of network codes, both connection and operation network codes. So I will give you the floor. Sometimes it's less straightforward actually to find the value in the connection codes, but actually we can reflect on we can actually consider a little bit what would be the value based on this disturbance. So going back in time, 4th November of 2006, there was a switching off of 380 kV double circuit somewhere in Germany. That created a cascading effect, so many different lines tripped off, which actually created this, as we call it, system split. So it created two different areas with under frequency and one area in green here in our figure with over frequency. So this power imbalance is actually induced a severe frequency drop, mainly in the western area, which was also further increased due to the uncontrolled disconnection of the different generating units. So that created this problem, and the actually impact of this grid disturbance was that there was a lot of load shaded, basically 17 gigawatt there. There were a number of millions European households that were cut off, which of course is translated in a few million euros of economic losses. So this was actually a very kind of strong impact at that point. Of course, after half an hour there was a full synchronization again, and the normal situation came back after 2 hours. But nevertheless, there were lessons to be learned. One of them, at least concerning the connection codes, was that it is very important to have requirements for the generating units that are also connected to the distribution grid, that are similar or the same in terms of behavior during the frequency and voltage variations. I think this was important, that this was taken over when the RFG, at least the code, was under the drafting process. Of course, there were other lessons. Probably it's better if I give the floor again to Crystal to explain more on that.
Thank you, Yanis. Yes, exactly as you mentioned, system operation guideline and network code emergency restoration also took into account the valuable lessons learned from this event. And as the two main causes of this incident was insufficient inter-TSO coordination and non-compliance with N-1 criterion. Then the requirements for this were integrated in the operational codes, the coordination between TSOs with the help of RSCs being the most notable. So in system operation guideline you can find the rules for from coordinated outage planning and security analysis to the training of operators. And in network code emergency and restoration code, the design of system defense plans and restoration plans is defined, and also the RSCs will have a role in assessing the consistency of the measures of these plans on a regional level. Another important outcome of that event was the creation of ENTSO-E awareness system, which is a platform allowing TSOs to observe in real time the actual state of each TSO and also to quickly react during large disturbances. So now I give the floor to Fabian. Thank you.
Actually, let me hand over to Charles directly.
Yeah, so on slide 14, just a few concluding remarks. I think that the first point that we can draw as a conclusion from this exercise of looking at what's the types of value creation by the network code is that we can see the network code is really a cornerstone of the implementation of the internal energy market. It's a real source of creation for European consumers, and you can see from the indicators that the benefits are very substantial, and they contribute to the different pieces of or objective of the internal electricity market. The second point that we can draw from this assessment is that you can see the network codes may not even be entered into force yet, but still the benefits are still there. And this is also partly due to the proactivity of all stakeholders, whether it is the TSOs, ENTSO-E, the regulators and ACER, the Commission, and all the stakeholders in the working group and so on, which has enabled to achieve an early implementation of these network codes, and which allows them to already today develop substantial benefits. So a few examples are listed here, but for instance, the level of extension of the market coupling of now 23 countries which are coupled, one market coupling with 19 member states coupled, one with 4. You have already continuous cross-border implicit trading in many borders, flow-based in Central West, and all of this generates a lot of benefits. Second example, which is also quite striking, is the pilot project for cross-border balancing, which again provide already today a very substantial value, even though the balancing guidelines is not yet entered into force. Third example is the RSC, so the regional security coordinators, which are already in place in most of the region, if not all now, and which contribute to ensuring the efficient and secure operation of the network and ensuring the coordination of TSOs in those regions where it's really of a tremendous importance to have the common views on what's going on in the network. Maybe a third point, which is maybe less visible, but which is quite important, is the fact that it's a solution which is, let's say, made in Europe. This level of coordination is quite unique across the globe. It's very much appreciated and observed by other countries, and we see and think, ENTSO-E can talk a bit more on that, but we see a lot of delegations of, I don't know, Japanese, American people who are interested in understanding a bit more these concepts of network code, how does it work, and how it could be actually implemented or translated in their own countries. So it's also something very important. But, last point, there is a but. There is still a lot of things to be done to ensure a full implementation of all these network codes, even though we have already achieved quite a substantial amount of things. There's still a lot of challenges ahead of us, of you, in terms of implementation. It is still complex. It will require quite a lot of time and efforts to make sure that we can implement these codes in time. If you look at the deadlines for the balancing guidelines, which are still quite ambitious, we will have something operational across Europe after 2020. So it will require time, and therefore it's a lot of efforts to be put there. Maybe moving on to the next slide. Just to illustrate a bit on these challenges and the milestones that we are looking in the near future. So, for instance, there should be an approval of the capacity calculation methodology this year. We expect to have intraday coupling go live in the first trimester of 2018. The RSCs should be fully implemented and operational on the 5 key services by the end of 2018, with the synchronous area operational agreement for March 2019. We also expect that all the connection codes will be implemented by September 2019. We expect to have a common platform for balancing in 2019 as well, and the full day and market coupling by the end of 2020. So a lot of work for the implementation of the codes, and also a few additional topics that came into the picture more recently. So, for instance, how do we integrate, ensure the efficient linking between the wholesale and retail markets? How do we realize demand-side response more efficiently, not only in the balancing market, but also more generally on all the parts of the market? How can we foster a more efficient cooperation between distribution and transmission system operator in a system where a lot of new generation is connected to the distribution level, but transmission system operators need to have also a very clear view on what's going on there to ensure security of supply at the European level. Questions about cyber security. So really a lot of things still ongoing, still to do. Maybe one last point on the next slide. If you want to learn a bit more on the content of the network codes, ENTSO-E, together with ACER, the European Commission, and a few also other partners, they are organizing an online program, online course of about the electricity network codes, which will last for 6 weeks, so between the 10th of October and 24th of November, and which will allow you to, if you're interested, to get a bit more into the depth of the content of the network codes and what they will change in terms of the European market. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'll give back the floor to ENTSO-E for any additional remarks.
Yes, thank you very much to all the panelists for their interventions, and I hope it was a good presentation. We received 3 questions. I don't know if you want to send us more, so I will just leave close the floor for 5 minutes, and we will be back online at 3, and then we'll go through the questions. Talk to you then. Hello again. Just because I'm conscious of the time, I'm gonna, and I see the questions are slowing down, so I'm gonna start. Charles, Fabien, I'm gonna ask you to maybe start answering the questions, and then if you think it would be useful, then I can ask my colleagues here at ENTSO-E to add any other information. Is that okay with you?
Yes, perfect.
Okay.
Go ahead. I can start with the easiest questions, the more technical, let's say. There was one question regarding slide 8, just to explain what do we mean by 84% of efficient utilization of interconnectors already achieved. So that the meaning of this figure is looking at how the improvements of allocation mechanism have improved the efficient use of commercial capacity. So what we are looking is how much of the interconnection capacity, the commercial capacity, was used in the direction of the what we call the efficient direction, which is from the low price area to the high price area. It doesn't look at the relation between the commercial capacity and the physical thermal capacity of the lines. That's something a bit different where we haven't looked at, because actually it depends quite a lot on local situation, existence of loop flows and these kind of issues. So here we are really looking at the efficiency of the allocation of the commercial capacity.
Thank you, Charles. Asos, do you want to jump in, or are you fine with the explanation? Yeah. All right, that is fine. So Charles, maybe you want to take the next question.
Okay. Also one question is regarding our calculation was whether or how do we balance the value in terms of security of supply, in terms of reliability between regions, of interconnectors between regions. So maybe here one general remark regarding the calculation that we've done, or that sometimes these figures come from other studies like ASM monitoring report, for instance. And what is generally done is looking at historical values and looking at how much could have been improved if some of the mechanisms, for instance, would have been implemented. So these figures actually look or take into account the economic value based on the situation at that time. Also look at these values taking into account the reliability, the availability of the lines, for instance, or the generation plants at the time of the measures. So in that sense, that's the way we integrate the contribution to or the influence of the reliability of the interconnection. When it comes to the more technical codes, here we can see, for instance, when we look at the benefits in slide 12 or 13, for instance, we haven't provided like an aggregated value for the benefits, but we've mostly compare the cost, for instance, of the implementation of more coordinations and additional reserves, for instance, in slide 12, with the potential gains, but without doing science fiction, but just looking at that's the cost of the measures that were implemented. But if we had a major event, something like a blackout or a major disturbance like in 2006, the kind of value which is at stake is, as shown here in the slide, it's about 500 million euros for an hour of blackout only for Germany. So here it's more a question of balancing what's the cost of the implementation of these measures and the benefits in terms of granting the reliability and the security, the operational security of the system. And we have something equivalent in the next slide, which is basically looking at the return of experience of the system split in 2006. We can see that, we can expect that if all these measures, which are now integrated in the codes, all these measures would have been implemented, we wouldn't have gone through such a major event. Maybe there could have been some issues, but there would have been much more limited in terms of scope, and the kind of benefits that we would have had by having these codes in place are shown by the reduction in terms of losses due to load shedding. So again, we are talking about a few hundreds million euros just for one event. So it's really important also to value properly security of supply or operational security, because you can see that when these kind of major events occur, then the costs for the system can be very, very substantial. So it's very important also not to only look at of the benefits of trades, but also the benefits of security of supply. Any additions from ENTSO-E side on this question?
I don't. I look at my colleagues and no, they don't have anything else to contribute. One question that would be interesting to answer is the one regarding the benefits of coordinated balancing. Do you see the last question, Charles, that has come in? It says,
Yeah.
if only the 3 examples presented the benefits. Yeah, that's it. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because that's something we discuss quite a lot with the teams involved in the project, and this is true that when we sum up the benefits of the current project, they seem quite high already compared to the expected benefits in 2030, which are forward-looking. So what is important first to bear in mind of modeling assumption is the 3 pilot projects here that are presented are based on historical data, and which also means that it takes into account the inefficiency of the market, not only in the balancing time frame, but also in intraday or in day ahead, for instance. Whereas in 2030, the kind of exercise that was done to calculate these figures is a forward-looking exercise, where we assume that market coupling, intraday trading is implemented and works efficiently, and then the benefit is only the benefit of having full integration of the balancing market as a residual improvement compared to an already well-functioning market design. So this difference in semantic is quite important, because that explains part of the difference in terms of values. For instance, when you implement a project like TER, for instance, between the countries which are participating, so you have 120 million euros per year as benefits, which is very huge for such projects. But we expect that over time this will be probably a little lower, because there will be less inefficiencies in intraday. There will be more efficient in trade trading, and therefore less residual needs for the balancing time frame. Maybe one last point is also important to bear in mind when we look at the details of the source of the studies that we use there. When we talk about 500 to 800 million euros, we are talking about frequency restoration reserves, and therefore we don't look at replacement reserve. So actually the good comparison is to look at project that looks at imbalance netting and the coordination of frequency restoration reserve, so like the IGCC or the RPM in the Nordic. But Terra is a project in addition to that, because it's coordinating the replacement reserves that are not taken into account in the study that quantified the gains for the forward-looking for 2030.
Thank you. Yes, that's a detailed explanation. Charles, because we have reached already the time, what I'm proposing is that we will answer the questions that we weren't able to answer now, and we'll answer to them on by email after the webinar. So everybody will receive an answer to their question. But we will have to close the webinar now. So I would like to thank everybody, my colleagues here at ENTSO-E, and also, of course, Fabien and Charles. We will make the slides available on ENTSO-E's website. We will also share any relevant information with the attendees, and there might be also a recording of the webinar available. We need to check the quality first before we publish. All right, thank you very much, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Charles. Thank you, Fabien, and we'll talk to you next time at another ENTSO-E webinar. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.